Hello, Bible readers. Genesis continued takes us into chapter 12, verse 10 through chapter 13, verse 18. Here is where we first see Abram and Sarai in Egypt, where Abram is presented as an anxious man, a man of unfaith, followed by a story about Abram and Lot, where Abram is much more like the Abram we saw at the beginning of chapter 12 when God says, "Go," and Abram just goes. Then he relied only on God's name. The call of God had been fully accepted and embraced. That was where the history of Israel began, and that was the ground upon which the history of Israel would walk from. But if that's all we knew about this person, Abram, it wouldn't seem like a real experience of life and all its challenges meeting God and all God's promises. It's just not that easy to be told to go and just go. So chapter 12, 10 to 20, admits that faith is not easy. In fact, it's always a battle. Even Father Abraham, we see, struggles for faithfulness and doesn't always find the way. Chapter 13, though, shows Abraham as a marvelous model of faithfulness. By being so different from each other, we learn a lot about God in the midst of Abraham's inconsistent and yet very realistic behaviors. So the question in today's texts, two of the questions anyway, are, will this God keep his outlandish promises? And the second question is, will the seeking man and woman who are going as commanded, will they be able to trust the promise? They're two very different questions, but they always come together. One cannot exist without asking the other. Will this God keep God's promises? Will the man and woman be able to trust the promise? So the first the chapter 12 anxious Abe story is what I'll talk about first. Brueggemann says, this is a narrative told by a powerless community to maintain its courage, identity, and dignity in the face of overwhelming odds and unresponsive power. The story obviously makes Egypt look silly, which would have felt good for little Israel to mock an empire. Abraham is shrewd, Sarah is irresistibly beautiful, the Pharaoh just can't help but gush all over them both. But here's the meaning of the story that I want to share from Brueggemann. He says, our interpretation has to do neither with humor nor with morality. It concerns the strange way in which Abraham is caught up in the history of God's blessings and curses. There is much here that is not and must not be explained. Why does God smite Pharaoh when it is unambiguously Abraham who's created the problem at hand? Great question. Although we may be rooting for Abram as the little guy in the face of the mighty Pharaoh, he's the one, Abraham's the one to blame for Sarah being taken into the Pharaoh's home. What could the point be? Abraham may indeed have the power to cause a blessing for an outsider, but he also has the power to curse. The curse does not fall on himself, but on innocent others. Both Abraham and Pharaoh are on notice, and we as readers are on notice. It is dangerous business to deal with Abraham. When Abraham acts faithlessly, curse gets released on the world. That was God's promise. I will curse those who curse you. So the faith of Israel matters for all the nations. So that's part of what this is meant to mean. The other point is that for all the faithlessness of Abraham in this particular story, God still protects Abram. So will Abram trust the promise? Clearly not always. There's that answer, but will God keep his outlandish promises? Yes, even through Abram's mistrust. So that's what we learn from that story. I have less to say about chapter 13, mostly because I don't have much time. Here's one big takeaway for me. Brueggemann says, the common economic view of the world, whether seen by capitalists or Marxists or others in between, the common view is scarcity. That's the assumption. There's only so much, and so we all have to compete for stuff. Conflict, competition, and aggression are appropriate ways to handle economic matters. That's how we've all been trained to think about economics. There's only so much to go around, and so I better get what I not just need, but what I want. In this story, Abraham has to divide up wealth. In faith, living outside the present wealth that he's enjoying and living into God's promised future, because that's what faith is, living outside of the present, focusing on God's future. In faith, Abraham refuses to live in a worldly economy where he's supposed to be in conflict, in competition with Lot. And so Brueggemann says this: the vocation of Abram is to live in the economy of promise. That's a great phrase. The family of Abraham is called to be heirs, not predators, purchasers, or thieves. These two stories, the end of chapter 12 and chapter 13, the two stories, they're meant to offer a very stark contrast to each other, almost like object lessons on what happens when Abram is faithless, curses, and what happens when he lives in this new economy of, the economy of promise. And that is blessings. The texts they leave a community of faith with decisions to make as they discern what is faithful, understanding that our choices could create curses or blessings for people around us. Okay, so next is please read chapters 14 and 15. Chapter 15 is a very big deal, not just in Genesis, but for the idea of faith as it's presented in the New Testament. So be ready to go deep into chapter 15. I am one with my God. My God is with us, all of us, at all times and in all places.